All right, welcome back to Major Religions of the West. In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing the sacred texts of Judaism, and those three main texts that we're going to be addressing are called the Torah, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. And so, as we're looking at these today, just thinking about the text that the Jews are using for their particular religion. And so, first of all, we talked a little bit about last time I mentioned the Torah, and there in the Torah I said it's usually translated as law, but it can also be translated, the word Torah can be translated as instructions or teaching, and so you might see those translations there as well. The word sometimes refers to the first five books of the Bible, but it can also be used to refer to what is also called the Tanakh. And the Tanakh really just is the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. And so the Talmud, the Torah is usually that those first five books, and then the Tanakh is usually the entirety of the text. And that's how I'll try to use them, but sometimes you'll hear someone refer to the Torah as that Hebrew scripture as well. So in our case, though, we're going to differentiate the two by calling the Torah the first five books, and then the Tanakh there is the entirety of that Jewish Bible. So, um, as a whole, to be more specific, we can also talk about those first five books. They can also sometimes be referred to as the Pentateuch, and Penta there in Greek just means five, and so you might hear them referred to as the Pentateuch as well instead of the Torah. The Torah is in Hebrew, and the Pentateuch is in Greek because what happened was that when the Jews lost their homeland, like we talked about last time, and they started being spread all over the world. The most common language of the world at that day was Greek, and so like English is kind of the common language. Like if you're going to communicate with someone else in another land, if neither of you speak each other's language, maybe you both speak English. And so Greek was kind of that catch-all. It's called Koine Greek, a common Greek. And so what happens is that as the Jews are being scattered throughout the known world at that time, the ability to read and write in Hebrew began to diminish as they were scattered to different cities, and so they translated the Torah into Greek, and so the Pentateuch is the Greek translation of those first five books of the Bible. All right, so whatever you call that particular section, we're going to call it the Torah. Whatever you call it, though, it does include the first five books of what most of us are used to calling the Bible. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And what we're going to do kind of quickly here is look at an overview of those first five books because they are considered to be the most authoritative and the most important in the Jewish faith. Traditionally, they are said to have been written by Moses, although more scholarly endeavors have recently said that there's probably four sources that somehow combined and worked together to write those first five books. And we're going to talk a very, very little bit about what that might look like. Although, again, traditionally they are written by Moses. We'll see as we move forward. Uh, Even those who are not very religious have had their lives shaped there by the Torah. For example, we all take a break from our labors once a week, and this is what we call a weekend, but this tradition comes to us there through the Torah in the Jewish law code. The idea here is that you don't work on the Sabbath. So there is one day a week where you take a break and you don't work. And we now extend that to two. But that idea of taking a break from labor comes to us through the Torah, through the Jewish tradition, the Jewish tradition. So there's a number of other contributions that the Torah has given to us as well. We see it in aspects of art and in literature. There's so many stories that come through and come to us through and kind of around this idea, the different stories that are there in the Torah as well. Much music comes to us through this. Laws, certainly, we see a number of laws even here in the United States that are influenced by the Torah as well. Politics, history, ethics, and even science, all of these things are influenced by the Torah. The Torah is one of the foundations for Western civilization, and so it's something that you see traced through into other countries as well. It's not just here in America, but you see it traced throughout Europe also. So a tremendous amount of influence that it's had on our culture, um, even if we don't always understand fully the implications that it has for us. Early Christian missionaries to China were shocked to discover that the Chinese did not have any ancient creation myths. They believed that the ancient Chinese, or the Chinese early on, believed that the cosmos, the universe, was always functioning in the way that it is functioning now. And so that it had just always been here and kind of would always be here, that it had been here from eternity past and would continue on into eternity into the future. And so they were surprised to find out that the ancient Chinese did not have, the early Chinese did not have a creation myth. So, this idea of where did the cosmos come from? Most of us are going to be familiar, somewhat at least, with the story there in Genesis that God creates. So, in the beginning, you know, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then on the next day, He creates, whatever. And then on the next day, He creates whatever. And so, this idea of a deity coming in and causing these things and ordering these things, bringing about some type of structure. In fact, that's what the word cosmos just means. It means order. And so, cosmos there is this idea of the universe getting its order. What ordered the universe? Well, here in the book of Genesis, we see that a deity brings it to order, but the Chinese did not have that particular concept. Rather, it was just something that had continuously gone on, and it was thought that perhaps the reason that the Chinese, even though their science was way more advanced in the early years, the Chinese made huge progress in science and in advancements. Um, but then the Europeans started to catch up and then eventually to surpass many of the Chinese um, accomplishments. And the one idea behind this, and I'm not saying this is true, but it's just to kind of get you to thinking about how important these religious ideas are and how they have influenced something, like I said, even science is influenced by these particular ideas. So the Chinese didn't have this idea of a creator God who laid down laws and ordered the universe, where the Europeans did. And so many of the European scientists uh, were would state in their works that they were going and looking for the laws of creation, the laws that God laid down. God ordered this universe, and so many of their scientific achievements were they found them and they were searching for them because they were trying to, as it's been put, think God's thoughts after Him. And so the Chinese not having that creator God, perhaps they weren't looking for those rules of the universe, but the Europeans did have that creator God, the idea of bringing that structure. And so they were seeking to understand God's structure for the universe. And that's one way that even science is affected by the ideas of religion here. Right? Again, not saying that that's necessarily true. I think it has some merit, but really the point here is to say this really is affecting the European world and how we think even today. All right. In addition to its historical significance, the Torah also serves as a source of guidance and comfort for large numbers of people, despite the fact that the world is quite different today than it was 2,500 years ago. So even though it's been a very long period of time, it is certainly something that is deeply resonates with a very large number of persons on our planet. One reason this ancient text remains relevant is that its meaning and application have been continuously debated and reevaluated. This helps keep it alive in the hearts and mind of those who are debating it. Okay, so going back to this idea that it still provides a great amount of comfort for a lot of people here, um, even today. One of the things that I like to talk about in my philosophy and ethics classes is that humans today aren't so very different than they were even 2,500 or even 10,000 years ago. And what I mean is that the basics of what humans are and the way we think and what we are searching for in this world are basically the same, regardless of the date on the calendar. What changes is our technology, but humans basically don't change. We still love and hate, we still have fears and hopes, we still um, desire those same basic answers that ancient man was searching for as well. You know, what does it mean to be human? Why am I here? All of these things are things that we find throughout the writings of those individuals who were thinking individuals who really sat down and pondered and had the opportunity to sit down and ponder. We see that the same questions that we asked back then, questions of purpose and meaning, are the same questions that we ask today. So we still look for love. We still engage in activities that are trying to bring to us some type of beauty. Beauty can be found in different things, whether it's food or art or whatever it might be. So we engage in these types of pleasurable activities as well. So it's humanity really is basically the same. Our technology is more advanced. Yes, even if we manage to put somebody on Mars and say even create a city there on Mars, what's going to change with regard to the Martian city? The only thing that's really going to be different is the planet. Humans on that planet will still be after the same things that humans are after today. So I like to watch old movies, I like to read old stories, and what you find is it's basically the same. So, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest writings that humans have, and in that, all these things that I've been talking about, meaning and purpose, and why am I here, all that stuff is discussed in Gilgamesh. And then also, um, if you look at the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, it's thought to be the oldest of all of the writings in the Old Testament. And what you're going to find is a very human element there, that humanity is struggling with this idea of evil and suffering, and that was one of the most basic problems that humanity has always struggled with. And I think, and I'm kind of hate saying this, but and we will always have to struggle with that particular difficulty. And so we are basically the same. So is it any wonder then that the Torah still speaks to humans today? It spoke to humans in the past, so of course it's going to speak to humans today. All right. Yes, it is kept alive by those who are debating it today. Um, and it keeps it relevant. Thinking about something like artificial insemination or perhaps uh, um, stem cell research or something like that, those aren't things that humans debated in the past because they didn't have the technology to accomplish those particular scientific achievements. But today we have them, but we still often turn to a sacred text or an ancient text, or even if it's an ancient law code, for some type of wisdom on how we should proceed inside of these new technological uh, abilities. And so what we find is that our technology changes, but the human questions don't change at all. And so it's continuously debated, and now these ancient texts are speaking to people about what position do you take on something like stem cell research. It is kept alive because of these debates and the ongoing use of it. I like to tell my students, think of the body of water on the planet that is dead in that nothing grows in it, and that is the Dead Sea. There's a reason it's called the Dead Sea. And the reason that it's dead is because there's water flowing into it, but there's no water flowing out. And so it all just sits there and stagnates because there's no activity. And so it's not living water, it's not moving water. So one of the reasons that the ocean is living water is that it's constantly in motion. That allows that things in there continue to live. If it stops moving, then it's dead and nothing's going to grow in there. So things have to keep moving or they're just going to stagnate and die. The same thing is true of ideas. As long as we're debating them and talking about them and hashing them, they're going to stay relevant. And so that's what's happening here with this particular thing as well. And I will add quickly there that the Jews are going to argue about everything, every single aspect of everything in the Torah there and the Tanakh. They're going to argue and trace out all of these different kind of relative points. And one group of individuals might say we should go this way and another should go this way. So think of it kind of like a political two political parties squaring off in a way, and they're just going to argue. And that's going to be a lot of the way that they function here. So it does keep things alive. It keeps things interesting. And I like some of their approach. We'll talk about it a little bit, and we'll see, I think, hopefully why. It's useful. It's a good thing. Okay, so talking about the Torah then quickly, the contents of the Torah. The first book there is Genesis. The book of Genesis opens with 11 chapters about the early history of the world and humanity, creation, all those types of things. In chapter 12, Adam and Eve, all that stuff, those are found in chapters 1 through 11. Then in chapter 12, the focus shifts and it becomes about the story not of humanity, but instead about the story of Abraham. And Abraham, remember from the last lecture, is going to be the father of the Jews or the father of the Israelites, right? It's all the same people. We start learning about Abraham and his descendants. And so Abraham is going to have his son, Isaac, and then Isaac is going to have two sons, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob will eventually later be renamed as Israel. And this is very, very significant for a number of reasons. So as we see, again, there it starts with Abraham. And remember us talking about in the last lecture, this individual was over here. He was kind of pushed west with his flocks, and eventually they wind up in Egypt, right? So I'm giving you a little bit more inside of this story as well. But we already talked about Abraham, so I kind of wanted to jump even over Isaac a little bit and jump to Jacob and Esau. If you recall the story about Jacob and Esau, Jacob is the youngest brother, Esau is the oldest brother. Usually the birthright, the inheritance goes to the older brother, but in this case, Jacob in fact, tricks his older brother into giving up his birthright. And so Jacob is going to be the one who inherits the birthright from his dad. So when his dad dies, then he's going to become the leader of the family. Now, as it turns out, Jacob, the name Jacob, just means trickster. It is one who tricks. And so think of something like Loki the Trickster that's been made really popular again by the Marvel movies today, and you have the right idea. And that's who he is. He is a trickster. So getting Loki to stop being a trickster just goes against his entire nature. That's what he is. Jacob is a trickster, but eventually he's going to become named Israel instead. So he won't be named Jacob any longer, but he will be Israel, and he will be the father of the Israelites, the Jews, the Jewish nation, the Israelite nation, all the same people. Okay. So, um, God, remember, chose Abraham, and he promised him land, and he promised him offspring, and he promised him great fame, and that God was going to reach into the world through his particular line and bring salvation to humanity. And there in this book of Genesis, we see this story unfolding, Abraham and Isaac, and then Jacob who becomes Israel. We see all of these different stories told there in the book of Genesis. And there are lots of complications and uh, difficulties along the way. There's barrenness, there's political conflict, there's family squabbles, there's the test of Abraham's faithfulness. There's all kinds of different issues that come up. I think one of the intriguing things about the Hebrew Bible, and really most sacred texts, but certainly in this case, as we're here on the Hebrew Bible, is its incredible humanity. You don't see these superheroes walking around bringing about God's will on earth and doing it in a flashy, wonderful style. It's usually pretty gritty and grimy, and by the time you get into it, you're like, what are these people thinking? Didn't they know? Can't they make good choices? And then I would, encourage you very quickly to kind of look at yourself and say, am I making good choices? Okay, that got too much like a sermon and too personal, and so I'm steering away from it. But we do see a lot of humanity in these stories. As I say, they get pretty down in the dirt. Okay, so in Genesis, we see all of that, the story of how humanity begins, and then we see the story of the family that God is going to use to bring about salvation for humanity, and how they begin, how they enter the world. And a lot of that they're found in Genesis, and all of it's found there in Genesis. There's other stuff, but that's kind of where Genesis is, the beginning. Here's how humanity gets started, and then humanity, the focus shifts from humanity towards this one family and how that family is supposed to bring about salvation for humans. All right, so that's just kind of a nutshell of Genesis. Way too fast, obviously, but that's what we've got. So next, the second book of the Torah is Exodus. And you can just hear the word exit in Exodus, and that's kind of the way why it's called this. And the idea here, the story that this particular book is going to tell, is the story of the Israelites exiting from Egypt and then coming into the Promised Land. So if you remember in the last lecture, we talked about that in quite a bit of detail. So I'm not going to go into lots of that this time, but I just want you to understand that this is where the majority of that story is found. So there they were slaves in Egypt, if you recall. They were over here. They got pushed further this way. They wind up in Egypt. They come out of Egypt. They wander around there in the wilderness for quite some time, and then eventually they're going to uh, conquer the land of Canaan. And all of that part of the story is contained in Exodus. So they exit, and then there is no introduce, but maybe there should have been, because they exit from Egypt, and then they enter the Promised Land, and all of that story is found there in the book of Exodus. Okay. So we talked last time about there at Sinai, God makes a covenant with his new people, gives them the Ten Commandments, and they, of course, the golden calf, they screwed up, so they got a new set of Ten Commandments. The commands were the same, but they had broken the first one, so Moses broke those tablets, and then he comes down with a new set of tablets, still the same commandments, but right on new stone. Okay, all that stuff happens. They go into the Promised Land. Remember that there were 12 tribes of Israelites, and when they got into the Promised Land, remember I told you that each of the tribes settled in specific areas. And then eventually, remember me talking about that those northern 10 tribes, they split off from the southern 2 tribes after the death of Solomon. And then they were conquered first, and then later the southern 2 tribes were also conquered. So just kind of put that back into your brain. Right, so we've exited Egypt, we've come into the Promised Land, and each tribe over quite a bit of period of time. This doesn't happen really super quickly. There's a good amount of time of conquest and settlement, but eventually those 12 tribes each have their own little area, their own little, I'm just going to say, state or county, right? And so all of the Levites are over here in their little area, and Judah's got his tribe over here, Benjamin up here. Okay. All right. So the next book um, is the book of Leviticus. And in Leviticus, what we find is passages that are concerned with its writings about rituals, how to properly, it is instructions on how to properly offer sacrifices, how priests should operate, how festivals should be done and when, and also what food is permissible, and then finally also how to deal with sin. And so all of these things are contained in the book of Leviticus, which just seems like an odd name if you're not familiar with it. Why is it called Leviticus? And the answer is really pretty simple. The tribe of Levi, there of those 12 tribes, one of them was Levi. There was 12 sons, and each tribe is named after one of the sons. I don't think I told you that. So there in the tribe of Levi, the tribe that's named after Levi, all priests come from that tribe. And so if you were in the tribe of Benjamin, you couldn't be a priest. That's not something you get to do. You could only do it if you were from the tribe of Levi. And so Leviticus just is the priestly writings to say, here's how we're going to function within our tabernacle or temple, or whichever the case may have been at that time. When they're wandering in the wilderness, they had a tent called the tabernacle, and that operated as their temple. Once they take the promised land, establish Jerusalem, Solomon's going to build a temple there, and they don't use the tabernacle. They now use the temple as their place of worship and to offer sacrifices and all of these different things. So the book of Leviticus really just is instructions on how to manage temple activities, worship activities, all of those types of things. So that's what Leviticus is. Okay. All right, the next book in the Torah is called Numbers. It gets its name from a census of the Israelites that was taken. And so they're going to count stuff, and that's why it's called Numbers. So God had intended to give them a promised land in Canaan shortly after the revelation at Sinai, that is to say, after he gave them those 10 Commandments. But they rebelled, of course, and they didn't get to take possession of it. They had to wander around even longer, and so some of the story is contained here in Numbers. But God does keep his promise. So even when the Israelites break their promise, they break their covenant, God remains faithful to them, even though they don't remain faithful to him. And so what we see is that God takes care of them. This is where we get the story about God feeding them with manna, the bread from heaven, every day. And then also he blesses them so that their sandals don't wear out, that kind of thing, right? So we see all these things taking place here in the book of Numbers. The last book of the Torah is called Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy basically is just translated as the second law. And so what happens is that before Moses dies, and Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land. And so just before Moses dies, he gives a great speech. And this speech is basically telling the people, if you're faithful, God will bless you. If you're not faithful, then God won't bless you. So stay faithful, and then God will bless you, and you'll be able to conquer and take the land, and you'll prosper, and all of these different things, right? So if you're faithful, blessings, and if you're not faithful, curses, right? And so this is a big kind of oh, kind of a big encouraging sermon to try to make sure that these people, follow the laws of God as they're trying to take the promised land. So, all right, we see much of that there. It's contained in the book of Deuteronomy, and so that second law. And so it's not just the Ten Commandments, but it's something that Moses is admonishing them to follow as well. All right, so that's the first 5 books, again called the Torah. And the Torah is the most prized possession in any synagogue today. And so remember me telling you that once the Jews lost their Holy Land, once they were kicked out for that final time until after World War II, but once they were kicked out of that by the Romans, they were dispersed. Not that all the Jews were kicked out of the Promised Land, but as they were scattered around the world, remember they had to try to keep their religion, and they had to try to keep their Jewish identity alive. And so what did they do? They formed synagogues, and in those synagogues they had teachers called rabbis, and those rabbis, kept teaching their particular religion to Jews, no matter where they were in the world. And so we have synagogues, which is kind of a temple slash school. They don't sacrifice in them, but it's a temple slash school where people go to worship. Think of it like a church, and you've got the right idea. So, if you go into a synagogue today, the most prized possession is going to be that Torah scroll. Now, if you grew up, I'm thinking of Christian tradition, and you walked into that sanctuary, you might see, like on a table down in the front of that sanctuary, maybe right in front of a pulpit or right in front of the stage, there might be a table, and on that table there might be a Bible, and it's usually opened right at some point in there. And so the idea here is that here is our sacred text, and this is a primary focus every time you walk in the doors and sit down. You see this, and it's going to be somewhat the same here in this case for the Jews, right? So a very, very important thing for them is their Torah. All right. The Torah was not only encountered in ritual and worship, but it also studied intensely. The main passages of the covenant and ethical monotheism came through clearly, but the rabbis also noticed gaps and redundancies and contradictions, and they sought to explain those things in sophisticated ways. But the idea here was to try to harmonize all of the different passages there in the Torah. So that's going to lead to a lot of in-depth study. Now, what do we mean by an in-depth study? With all of these sacred texts, an in-depth study is more than simply just a reading, and there's nothing wrong with just a basic reading of a sacred text. Many Jews and Christians and Muslims engage in that type of activity where perhaps you've got some reading that you do once a day or whatever it might be for you. But when we're talking about in-depth study, we're talking about starting to go into it much, much more deeply, where you start taking it apart perhaps line by line or even word by word, and you start trying to understand the language that it was written in originally. You start trying to understand historical context. You have to think about the type of literature that it is, meaning is it history, is it poetry, because that's going to influence the way you think about that passage, because you don't read poetry the same way you read history. If you sit down and read a poem and then you sit down and read a book on history, you're going to have two different voices in your head as you're reading them. Here's how you read poetry. Here's how you read history. And so you also have to consider the type of literature that it is that you're reading. And so there is a lot that goes into an in-depth study of some of these sacred texts. And so what happens is that the Jews start studying it even more and more deeply. You're not going to just read it for where that was, oh, that's a nice story, and I believe that blah 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 blah. But instead, start trying to look at it and truly understand what it means at a greater depth. And so, Christians who adopted the Torah as part of their own sacred text saw the law of Moses as superseded in Christ. Uh, Thus, they mostly ignored the regulations of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, while they kept the Ten Commandments. But they're going to criticize the rest of here the Christians call the Old Testament laws as being overly legalistic and ritualistic. And so they're going to say all of that was fulfilled in Christ, and so we don't have to do it any longer, right? So something like, for example, we see there in Leviticus the proper way to sacrifice, say, a lamb. Well, what is the lamb and what is that sacrifice? Well, we know, we understand there from reading these sacred texts, the theology here is that without the shedding of blood, sins can't be forgiven, right? So in this case, you shed the blood of a lamb, and that lamb's death symbolizes your own removal of sin from you, which sin is equated with death in this theology. So it's the removal of death from yourself. It's the removal of sin from yourself. How is that accomplished? It's through the shedding of blood, and in this case, the shedding of the blood of the lamb. But this is why Christ is called the Lamb of God, the one who takes away the sins of the world, because Christ comes into the world, dies on the cross, sheds his own blood, and then we don't have to sacrifice lambs any longer because Jesus is the one who takes the place of all lambs. And so there's no more killing lambs, no more shedding lamb's blood because the Lamb of God, he's already shed his blood. And so the idea here is that Jesus fulfilled the law. He's not abolishing it. And if you know that scripture quote, right, Jesus said, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it in order to make it full and complete. So no more sacrificing of lambs because I am the perfect sacrifice, right? And that's what he's saying. So that includes even food laws. And if you see there in the book of Acts, there's one story where that sheet is lowered from heaven. It's in a dream. A sheet is lowered from heaven. There's all these different animals in there, and this Jew's commanded to kill and eat. He's supposed to go kill and eat, and all these animals that are unclean, pigs, for example, are in there. And God said, if I created it, it's not unclean. And so we at this point, if you're not Jewish, if you're Christian, you might look at this and say, see, we don't have to follow these food laws any longer because, you know, Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. And in this case, if it's something God created, then it's clean. So you don't have to follow these particular rules and rituals and all this different stuff any longer. And that's what many, many Christians have said and believe. But there is uh, in some of the minds, some of the Jews, and not all Jews follow all these laws, but in the mind of some of the Jews, the idea of following these laws really is part of the point because you make your life holy, they say, by following these laws, even in today's modern world. And so, if you want to have a life that is sacred and holy, then you continue to follow the laws. And so, some Jews do. Again, not all. All right. So, remember me telling you that we started trying to look at some of these sacred texts in a more in-depth way and study them in a more in-depth way, and that this happens with the Hebrew Bible. And so about the time of the Enlightenment, scholars of ancient languages and documents began to apply the methods they used in studying other ancient texts to the Bible. And so remember I mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, so I'll just use that again. The Epic of Gilgamesh, many of the scholars, they're going through this really trying to understand fully and completely more about the author, right? And trying to understand and see more about the author's style and the nuance. It's going to be true of something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but you can also see them starting to apply these methods to other ancient writings. So something like, say, um, uh, uh, like Livy's writings, or like the history of Rome, or like Caesar in the Gallic War, or something like that. So you might see these other ancient texts that the scholars start trying to take them apart and really understand more of what's happening behind the text itself. They start doing this with the Hebrew Bible, trying to understand more and more about um, the writers of the Hebrew text, of the Hebrew Bible. And what scholars began to notice, for example, here, is that in some passages, God is referred to as Elohim, which is what we translate into English as God, right? Other times, the text would use the word Yahweh, which we in English translate as Lord. And what you find is that these two words are used kind of mixed together. One time they'll use this one, and another time they'll use this one, but they might use it like here in this passage, and then the other one they might use here in this passage, right? Um, why is that odd? I should explain why that's odd. Typically, when we write, most of us use the same kind of words and phrases. We don't really mix things up. Most of the time, we have our pretty consistent ideas that we kind of go to, and we tend to do it really without thinking. That's what's called a writing style. And so everybody's kind of got a style that they have, and it's something that you kind of evolve and grow into as you write. And as you write, it will develop and somewhat change and be hopefully perhaps more refined. And so, if you wanted to think about this on the level of something a little more common, think of it this way. Think of somebody like Stephen King, who, if you read a novel of his, um, and then you turn around and you read another like horror story novelist, you're going to find that there's a different style. And if you're really familiar with King, and I don't read horror stories, so I'm not, but if you're familiar with King, you could, without knowing which book was which, you could pick him out because you would be attuned to his particular style. This is the way he tends to write, and he tends to flow, and he uses these words, or he has just that. Again, the word is just style. He's got a certain flair. He's got a certain flavor that is just Stephen King. Um, and so they began to realize that there seems to be different flavors inside these passages. And so they began to think maybe there that the Torah was not written entirely by Moses, but maybe it was written by multiple authors and at different times. And I'm going to say with different goals, with different ideas, not goals that were contrary to each other, but it seems almost like they were reading along, and they might add in their own particular style, right? So think of it as a pot of stew, and we thought for a long time that there was only one cook, and now we're looking at this again from a new angle, and we're thinking maybe there were multiple cooks who were cooking up this particular text, right? Okay, so it occurred to scholars that the Torah might not have been written all at once and by Moses, but it might be composed of several different. It might have been composed by several different authors and over a longer period of time, and then eventually it's kind of assembled and put together into one work at some point or throughout time. Throughout time. In fact, many anomalies in the Bible start to make sense when we recognize that the text came into being through a long and complicated process and through perhaps multiple authors. In addition, scholars deciphered long lost languages. They began to unearth ancient artifacts, and it became easier to understand the Torah in its original historical context. In that it's going to have, have the opportunity as well to compare it to other ancient texts, other different, I'm going to say, mythologies. And that's not to say that it's not true, only to say that I refer to all of them as mythologies, and then it's kind of fair and easy, right? So we begin to compare it also to other mythologies, which was very helpful. For example, if you look through ancient myth stories, you'll find that a very large number of the mythologies around the world include a flood story. And so the flood story is not just something that we find there in the Torah in the first part of the Old Testament, but it is a story that we see from many different cultures in many different countries. The Asian cultures, they have a flood story. Even as far away as Australia, there is a flood story inside of their mythology as well. So it seems that there, really possibly was this kind of massive flood. Was it fully global in the sense of that every mountaintop in the entire earth was covered? I don't know. That's not the point of this discussion. All that we're trying to say is that it would seem that, hey, all these mythologies have this inside of them, so maybe there's some type of legitimacy to it as well, right? So if we begin to understand that this is a text not that was written all at once and by Moses, but perhaps it was written over long periods of time and then put together, maybe that kind of helps explain why there's some anomalies inside of it as well. It doesn't fit together perfectly because it wasn't written all at once and fully just laid out in perfect order. Okay. So by the late 20th century, scholars had arrived at the conception of the Torah as a combination of four basic sources. The first of those sources was called the J source, and that J source is the one who is the Yahwist source. And so when that person's writing, they tend to call God Yahweh. It's always Yahweh. The second source, and that particular individual seems to also think of God in a somewhat anthropomorphic fashion. He humanizes him. He makes him, he gives him human characteristics and traits. And this is a deity who speaks directly to humanity. And so kind of offsetting that, right? So keep that in mind. And then on the other side of it, the second source is called the E source, or the Elohimist. It's the one who writes Elohim instead of Yahweh. And he, rather than having God communicate directly with humans, seems to have God communicating mostly through dreams or through angels. And so you get these kinds of significant differences in the way that the styles are coming out. So you've got this different style. They're using different names for God, and then this one only, this one has God talking to people directly, and this one has God talking to people through dreams and angels. And so you can see what I mean. God's still talking to people, and when they say, whether they say Elohim or Yahweh, they're still talking about God, but the flavor of the stew is going to be slightly different. The stories are going to come together slightly different because of the tendencies of these different writers. That's at least what the theory is bringing about. So at some point, the J and E sources were combined and augmented by a third source called the Deuteronomist. That's the D source. And that, the Deuteronomist, he seems to emphasize centralizing worship and sacrifice at the temple there in Jerusalem. Right? And so it seems that the D source came in, he finds the J and the E source, and he pulls them together a little bit, but then he adds his own flavor to the stew as well, and he says, I'm going to emphasize the temple. Right? And then finally, the fourth one, the last one, is called the P source, and it's the priestly source. And this one is very interested in including in the text things like boundaries and how the priests and the tabernacle and the temple should work together and for the people. So he's very interested in priestly stuff, right? So yet again, another flavor is added to the stew. And so we find that these particular things seem to be there in the Torah. These different concepts seem to be there within the Torah itself. And so, is that really the case? Is it really the case that there were different sources that came together and augmented or flavored the text along the way? Or is it the case that Moses just wrote and he emphasized different stuff at different times? which one is it? And I'll add a little bit more here at the end. So let me kind of get through that's kind of the academic stuff that I'm trying to trudge through, and then we'll talk a little bit here in a moment. In recent decades, this neat scheme of the four different sources has been disrupted. Perhaps it is thought, was in fact an oral tradition, right? So maybe it was something that wasn't originally written down, but maybe it was something that was passed down and memorized from one generation to the next. Maybe that's what the E source was. And so it's kind of hard to say. And um, oral sources are something that was very common then, less common now. We don't memorize nearly as much as the ancients did. Let me say that oral text doesn't mean that therefore it's somehow flawed. That's simply not the case. In fact, even today we have an example of an Eastern religion, an individual. It has been confirmed through studies that he has memorized over 6,000 different texts, 6,000 different I'm just going to say like verses and paragraph type things, right? So he's memorized 6,000 different verses, and he gets them correct all the time. And so it's really, that doesn't mean incorrect. It just means that they perhaps didn't have or did not wish to put these sacred texts into writing until more recent times. And today, I'm kind of ashamed to say I have a hard time memorizing just really about anything. And so memorization was much more part of the ancient world than it is our modern world, but they were really good at it. They were really, really good at memorizing massive text, so it doesn't mean that it's flawed. Okay, so perhaps E was, in fact, an oral tradition. Perhaps the four major sources were the products of different scribal schools rather than individuals. So originally the idea here was that each source was a person. Now the idea is becoming maybe each source wasn't a person, maybe it was a group of persons who were working on this text and adding a flavor. So maybe it was a group of cooks rather than a single cook adding to it here. The various strands of the Torah have proven difficult to disentangle, and today all scholars now accept, but now nearly all scholars accept that the text had a long and complicated editorial history. It's not easy simply to say, okay, this passage was written by J and this passage was written by E, and it's not that simple. It's much, much more complicated to try to pull them apart and say, and it's all clear and obvious. Stephen King wrote this part, and I'm just going to say Shakespeare wrote this part. It's just not that simple, right? Even though they have very different styles, it's not that easy to just pull them apart and say, here's the one that was responsible for this particular part of a passage. It's not that simple. Although most scholars do say it probably wasn't written by one person. Rather, instead, it was written by multiple people and over time. The insights of the historical critical method have been challenging for some believers because they complicate the traditional story that Moses wrote it. But really, it shouldn't bother you too much, and in the sense of that, the tradition was that Moses wrote all of this. Um, Let me put it to you this way, and this is, where does the rubber meet the road on this? Okay, if the Old Testament, if the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible, really is the Word of God, then hopefully God would be powerful enough to protect that text and have it turn into what He wants it to turn into. And so perhaps believers should not be too skittish, they shouldn't be too worried that maybe Moses didn't write all of it, or that the text was built over time. Remember us talking about progressive revelation, and that sometimes God reveals a small something about himself, and then later on he reveals more. Based on what he revealed originally, now we can understand more, and then later more, and then later more. Maybe that's the way it worked. Um, but it shouldn't worry you too much that maybe it comes to us from not just Moses, but from others as well. Um, so just to kind of help you, if you're wondering, what does all this mean for me? And the answer might be, it really doesn't mean much other than to say that perhaps now you go to this text again later and you have more of insight into what might be happening inside the text. Perhaps you're thinking a little more deeply about what's going on than just the basic story, right? And so, uh, just kind of something to think about, but again, shouldn't worry you too much. If it really is God's word, then God's probably going to be protecting it here. Okay. All right. Let me think. Okay. So that was kind of the Torah and thinking some about the Tanakh, other parts of it as well, but mostly we focused there on the Torah. Now I want to talk about two other sacred texts, probably much less known in outside of the world of Judaism. These two are the Mishnah and the Talmud. So a little bit of historical setting here, just kind of remembering back through some of the history of Israel that we've already talked about. The process by which the Jews became the people of the book, that's in quotes, the people of the book. The process by which the Jews became the people of the book began after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and it reaches its culmination a few centuries after the Romans leveled the second temple in 70 AD. Okay, what does this mean? Sometimes today, the Jews are referred to as the people of the book. What does that mean? What it means is that today the Jewish faith, the Jewish tradition, religion, is focused around the Torah and the Tanakh. It's focused around the Jewish sacred text. Why is that the case? Well, originally, Judaism was focused around the temple. That was the central point um, of worship and the central point of activity for all Jewish faith and all of the Jewish religion. What happens, though, is that when the Babylonians destroy the temple in 586, they don't have a central worship place. The temple's gone. Now, where is the center for the Jewish faith? And so, remember us talking about how they had the prophets that, kept teaching and preaching and telling the people to turn back to God. We had that. So, the Jews do eventually get to go back into Jerusalem and they rebuild the temple. And so they have a second temple, but then like in 66 AD, they rebelled against the Romans. Remember us talking about how they weren't, they were rebellious type people. They were very, very aggressive and warrior type people. And so they rebelled against the Romans in 66 AD, and in 70 AD, the Romans won, and they went into Jerusalem and they destroyed that second temple. And now, where is the focus of the Jewish religion going to come from? And they began dispersing the Jews out of Israel as well. Why did they do that? Why did the Romans do that? Because they figured if they scatter them out into small enough groups around the Roman Empire, they would stop ganging together and fighting revolutions, trying to throw off Roman oppression and Roman rule, and then they could rule themselves and be ruled by God once again as well. So the Romans figured if they scattered them around far enough, and there just wasn't enough of them together in one community, they couldn't form up into any kind of rebellion. It's a pretty good idea. So that's what the Romans did, and as they were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, how are they going to maintain their religion and their identity there as God's people? Well, the temple's gone, so they can't focus and have a central religion around the temple. So now they focus on the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and that's going to be their central focus instead of the temple now. And so now they're not people of the temple any longer, but they are people of the book. This is their center, it's their core. It's where they turn for all of their answers, and all of their religious activities are going to somehow be tied with this text, right? So the sacred text is going to be very, very important here now. Okay, so in the absence of kings, they don't have a country anymore, so they don't have kings. Prophets are gone, priests are gone. A new group arose to help Jews. Why are the priests gone? Temple's gone, no more priests, right? So the priests are gone. A new group arose to help Jews scattered around the world, um, uh, help them to fashion a new identity and to preserve their tradition and their faith. These individuals, we talked about them last time, are called rabbis or teachers. And so think of it as um, refugees today in our country, if if a group of refugees is brought into the United States from, say, it doesn't matter, the Sudan, what are they likely to do when they all get here together? They're going to step off I'm going to say ship. They're going to step off the ship, and let's say into New York, or it doesn't make any difference what city, into New York, and they're probably all going to try to find somewhere together there in New York City to live. And so they're going to create a Sudanese, I guess, community there in New York. And we see this happening constantly. We had it happen with the Irish. There's lots of Irish communities. The Germans, there's German communities in the United States. And as refugees back then in the ancient world, the Jews did the exact same thing. Say they landed in the city of Rome, they stepped off the ship. What do? You immediately seek out any other Jews, like a Jewish neighborhood, right? And so they would go live there with the other Jews. And then what they had was they would have a school that would eventually be established, a synagogue, like we talked about, and there's going to be a rabbi there who's going to be the primary teacher in that school. Kind of like, I'm not going to say it's not a headmaster, but let's just say a head teacher, right? So that's how these different things began to form up and take place, and so all the Jewish schools, synagogues around the world begin to get established. That's not unusual. We still see those type things happening today, and it's exactly what happened back then. So, unlike the priesthood or kingship, the position of a rabbi is not a hereditary one. So, in priesthood, you had to be of the tribe of Levi, and so it's hereditary. And with kingship, usually passed from father to son, not always, but there's some type of heredity in there. So we send it, and it stays in the family. With the case of a rabbi, you don't get rabbi so and so over here, and then his son is automatically rabbi so and so. You have to go out and achieve that particular status, that particular teacher station on your own through individual effort and through study. So if you want to be a rabbi, you can, but you'll have to study in order to do it, right? Now, what happens is that, let me say kind of here, we'll look at this, right? Okay. So the historian Josephus described three philosophical groups or parties among the Jews in the second and first centuries BC. So this is before Christ, right? There were three basic parties. There's the Essenes, and there's the Sadducees, and there's the Pharisees. And you've probably heard of at least the Sadducees and the Pharisees if you're a Christian and you spent any time in the New Testament whatsoever. You probably know a little bit about those two, or you've at least heard the name. Okay, so the Essenes are the individuals who rejected the authority of the temple and the priesthood, and they withdrew from society, and they would kind of go out into the wilderness and focus themselves on purity and asceticism. And what does that mean, asceticism? It means that you don't partake in the pleasures of the physical world around you. So you don't eat food because it tastes good. You eat it because it sustains your life, but you're not eating pleasureful food. So you might eat something like bread and drink water, maybe some vegetables, but you're not going to be allowing yourself to find pleasure in what's called the flesh, right? So you don't drink wine, you just drink water. And obviously, you're not going to have sex because that's something that brings physical pleasure to you as well. And you're supposed to not be focused on the physical pleasures of this world. You're supposed to be focused on your purity, your spiritual purity. And so the Essenes were out kind of in the wilderness, and that's what they were doing. They, weren't engaged with the temple class, and they weren't engaged a lot with society either. We don't see a lot of them. I can't think of any instance in the New Testament. They might be there, but I can't think of any. Why weren't they there? Well, Jesus isn't going to really interact with them because mostly they're off out there. Jesus is going to interact often with the Sadducees and Pharisees because they're the ones who are in the towns and with the people. And so we know more about them. At least we have more stories about them because they interact with Jesus there in the New Testament. Okay. So the Sadducees, we talked about the Essenes. Now the Sadducees, they were the wealthy, aristocratic, priestly authorities who are associated mostly with the temple. And so when we say aristocratic, think things like duke, nobles, lords and ladies, that type of thing. So we're talking aristocracy, we're talking wealthy, right? Those are the individuals, the Sadducees, also associated mostly with the temple. The Pharisees, finally, were devoted to the study and application of Mosaic law. So, not aristocracy, think more lawyers, think more scholars, and they're not going to be focused on the temple, but they're going to be focused on the law of Moses, right? They're going to be focused on what's found there in the Torah, those first 5 books, right? So, Josephus tells us that the Pharisees were actually better liked than the Sadducees because the Sadducees, the wealthy aristocrats, were seen as somebody who collaborated with the Romans, and a lot of times, the wealthy aren't thought of as um, very well by the common people anyway. Sometimes they're thought of as being kind of oppressive to the common people, and in this case, the Sadducees weren't very well liked. But sometimes the Pharisees were. One of the main points of contention between the Pharisees and the Sadducees was the Torah. The Pharisees claimed that when God had given Moses when God gave Moses those first 5 books there at Mount Sinai, that God also revealed to Moses an oral tradition that was supposed to go along with the Torah as explanation and interpretation of that message, those first 5 books. So supposedly, according to the Pharisees, that oral tradition was passed down to Moses, and then the Pharisees were the ones who were continuing that oral tradition on. Now, the Sadducees said no, no such thing, but the Pharisees insisted that it was something that was given to Moses, right? And so what we find here is that this is going to lead us into those other 2 books, this oral interpretation, this oral tradition leading to interpretation and understanding, okay? All right. So, after the huge revolt of AD 66 that we talked about, I said, AD 66, the Jews rebelled against the Romans again. The Second Temple was destroyed there in 70 AD. Now, when that Second Temple was destroyed, the Essenes, the ones living out in the wilderness, a lot of them were wiped out as well because they were kind of fanatical and they were part of the rebellion. So, a lot of them were killed. And then also the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they lost a lot of their power and influence as well because remember, they were the aristocrats whose power was focused around the temple. But since the temple's gone, they lost a lot of their ability to be influential within the Jews, the normal everyday Jews as well. So, really, in this case, the Pharisees are going to become primary, and they're going to, I'm going to say, evolve eventually into that teacher aspect role of what we think of now as rabbis, because they were the scholars, the lawyers that sat and studied. They've still got their text, even though they don't have their temple any longer. And so those Pharisees are going to become the dominant, most important, most powerful of the of those 3 sects that were once in power. The Pharisees are going to be the ones that last. So the rabbis looked to the Torah, both the written and the oral tradition. Remember, Moses was supposed to have gotten that oral tradition there as well. They looked to it as the key to the survival of Judaism. No more temple, so where do we turn? But they were concerned about the accuracy and transmission of the oral Torah. Thus, about 200 AD, there's a rabbi whose name I cannot pronounce, and he wrote down the first part of that oral tradition. So they're going to say, look, we need to get this written down to ensure that it has accurate transmission down through the years. And so the first part of that oral tradition that was given to Moses is being written down. It is not exactly a law code, not like the Torah is a law code, but it's more a collection of legal judgments, some attributed to specific rabbis. Frequently, more than one opinion is recorded. So the Torah law code, this one is more interpretation of the law code that was given to Moses. So Moses wrote down you know, God's message there, wrote down the law, and then he was given the oral um, interpretation part of it as well, and that's what's going to start being written down here. But this is not law. This is something that is more up for discussion. It's something that you take and you chew on it to try to see, to to try to start thinking about and pulling out more of the important and the good stuff that's there in the law. And so this is cut and dry. This is the law over here, but this is more of a discussion about the law and its meaning. Okay. The Mishnah is a fairly lengthy book. It's organized into 6 parts, and I'm going to run through this really kind of rapidly. I just want you to understand a bit of what's in the content so that you have a concept of what's in there, but I'm not going to focus on the content whatsoever. So here's just kind of a, kind of a quick blow by blow of what's in there. Okay. 6 different parts. The first one is seeds, 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 the things that you plant and scatter, right? So the seeds and agricultures and prayers. And so it's a prayer that you might say, as you're planting crops or something like that. So the second part is appointed seasons, meaning things like a Sabbath or a festival or days of fasting or something like that. The third part concerns women, and it deals with things like marriage, divorce, and vows. The fourth part has to do with damages, including things like business relations, law, court, and punishment. The fifth is holy things, things like dietary laws, the temple, and sacrifices. And the sixth part is ritual purity and purification. Right? So how do you become purified? And there's another video later in the course that talks about ritual baths, and so you'll get more of an idea of what that's about as well. So that's basically what's in that Mishnah. The judgments in the Mishnah are terse and orderly, and meaning that they seem to be set up in such a way so that you could memorize them and kind of easily, so that it's not this lengthy necessarily dialogue that is something that you have to go back and read over and over and over again, but it's kind of quick and fast and easy, and you can memorize it somewhat quickly, so that some of that wisdom you can carry it around with you kind of in your pocket. All right. The first paragraph, for example, concerns rules for reciting the daily and evening prayer, and that daily prayer is called the Shema, Shema, the Shema. The passage also includes an argument. So we've got that first paragraph. It's talking about the daily prayer of the Shema, which is a very, very important aspect. I think Lord's Prayer in Christianity, except this is something that people recite uh, every day, right? So something that Jews recite every day. So that passage is in there. What are the rules for reciting the prayer, right? Now, within reciting the Lord's Prayer, I don't know that there's really rules about whether you have to stand or kneel or lay down or anything like that. But with the Jews, remember I said they were going to argue about everything, and so in this case, the question is, do you have to be lying down to say the Shema? Because there's a part of it in there where it talks about recite this as you're going out and coming in, and you're laying down, right? And the idea is that you say this uh, as you're laying down to sleep. You recite the Shema. Do you actually have to be laying down to recite it? Or is it okay? I want to say, is it kosher to stand up while you say that prayer, or do you need to be laying down in bed about to go to sleep? And so there is an argument there that's recorded in the Mishnah about whether or not it's okay to be standing up when you say the Lord's Prayer. I'm sorry, when you say the Shema. And there's 2 rabbis who are having this discussion, and they are actually very well known and very influential rabbis. And so it was a big deal. Which way is the right way to say this particular prayer? And so the Mishnah is going to go into lengthy discussion, lengthy debate and argument about different issues like that, and some that stuff like that. Okay. The Mishnah is obviously an unusual law code. It's multiple opinions are offered, and none are pronounced as just correct. And this is one of the things that I find very useful and interesting about the Mishnah. It's not a document where, and this is what you should do. It's not that law code like the Torah's law code, but instead it's this massive discussion where the Jews are trained to think about these important issues, but they're also trained simply in how to think. So if we have a discussion here between these two rabbis, and they're discussing something like the Shema and whether you have to lay down or not in order to recite it, the discussion is not, well, I like to stand up when I say it, therefore you have to stand or anything like that. It's much more of a logical, um, uh, logically structured discussion or argument, and they'll quote from the law. They'll pull things from the Hebrew Bible, a sacred text, and say, "See, hear this, dot dot dot, and because of this, dot dot dot, and because of this, dot dot dot." And so it's much more a logical argument. It's more like a court case and less like a preference discussion of people that might be having around a dinner table. And so it teaches this different students to begin to think logically, to begin to think rationally, and also to begin to understand if you accept this, then the consequences of accepting this particular aspect of this law are going to influence this over here as well. So it's teaching them to think logically and to begin to understand and anticipate consequences of, if you accept this, then these are the consequences, good consequences and bad. Or if you accept this, then here are the good and bad consequences as well. So it's a very useful teaching tool as well, not just part of this sacred text, and they definitely use it in that way. Of course, the conversations continued with rabbis and students, debating the meaning of the Mishnah, particularly in different academies. There were two academies in particular, one in Palestine, one in Babylonia, where these take place. There's lots of different traditions and lots of different disputations that are going to come to us through these two traditions. Eventually, they're going to be written down. They're going to contain things like legal analysis, folk tales, stories of famous teachers, aphorisms, scriptural interpretation, and much more. And so all of these things are going to come to us through those particular traditions, and again, they're going to be written down. The oral traditions in Palestine were edited and written down about 400 AD in what is commonly referred to as the Jerusalem Talmud, or the teaching or learning Talmud. So there in Israel and Palestine, uh, that tradition is written down, but then also there's a group of Jews living in Babylon, and they have these discussions and arguments as well. So imagine that, we're oh, here in Arkansas, and we were a group of Jews in Arkansas, and we're having a discussion about this, whatever topic, the Shema. And then there's a group of Jews in Texas, and they're also having the discussions, and we, have our debates, and then they're eventually written down. And then later, we discover, hey, that group of Jews in Texas also had these similar discussions, and we might read their discussions and see what kind of valid points they had made concerning the debate about the Shema. All right, the discussions in Babylon were similarly put into writing about 100 years later, so after the Palestinian uh, oral tradition was recorded. The Babylonian Talmud is about 3 times longer than the Jerusalem version and has long been considered more eloquent, more subtle, and more complete. It is second only to the Tanakh, the entirety of the Old Testament, in its sacred text in Judaism. So it's very influential, it's very important, highly sacred to the Jews. The Talmud is a massive work that reproduces the Mishnah in Hebrew and adds a commentary in Aramaic as well. This commentary is edited. This commentary is an edited transcript of the debates of the rabbis and their students as they have them, right? Um, so the Talmud here is um, it's more like a commentary, so to speak. And if you're not familiar with commentaries, um, it's, most of my students are Christians, so I'll use this as an example as well. There are multiple commentaries on the New Testament uh, written and published. Some of them are more simple and basic than others, and some of them are incredibly deep, like where you need to know Greek in order to really understand what's happening in this commentary, because they're not going to translate it for you, right? So they get pretty in depth. But what happens is that particular scholars will go and, as they have studied for years, and then they will pull all of their knowledge together, and then they'll put it into either a more basic commentary that most people can understand or more complicated ones for scholars. But a commentary is more than just commenting on a scripture passage. It is much more technical and is much more scholarly than that. But that's really what happens in a commentary is, like, say, for example, you open a commentary on Matthew, you're going to get in there, you're going to read a little bit of history, a little bit of background on what's happening, and then they're going to pull it apart verse by verse and say, here's what's being said, or here's what's significant in this verse with regard either to the Greek language or whatever language that might be used in that passage. But whatever's in particularly important about this, or if a person is mentioned that is particularly important, or if an event, or if whatever it might be, they're going to explain to the reader more in depthly what's going on inside that passage. So it's not just how do I feel about this passage. It's not that kind of commentary. It's more, here is the scholarly work based off of all these different studies that have taken place about what's happening in this particular work, verse by verse, sometimes even word by word, depending on the particular passage. Okay, so that's what we mean by commentary. So the Talmud is this uh, commentary, this incredibly uh, written by incredibly well-educated scholars who are saying, here's what's happening inside the Mishnah, right? So that's kind of what's happening here with the Talmud, and that it's also a very, very significant text, very significant part of the sacred scripture of the Jewish faith as well. All right, there are many great stories in the Talmud, but what we usually see on display is a detailed legal reasoning, often backed up by quotations from the Tanakh. In long, complicated arguments and frequent digressions, the rabbis will work their way through all aspects of Jewish life and lore with an astonishing level of psychological and philosophical nuance. So, what they're doing is they're taking all of the different passages apart and they're trying to explain and expound on those passages with their scholastic understanding, but also, again, as I said, with their understanding of psychology, even though they didn't term it that, but just the way humans think, and then also philosophy as well. And it is incredibly in depth and very complicated. It's logical progression. Think again like a law case. In a courtroom, the lawyer presents a case that is detailed and very well thought out. And that's what we see here in the Talmud. All right. Difficult scriptural interpretations of legal rulings from several generations are set side by side and given equal weight. So we might have, let's just say, like 6 different scholars who all write on a passage there, and their writings and ideas are recorded here in the Talmud. So if you're trying to interpret a very, very difficult passage, you might turn to a trusted scholar in the Talmud, right? And so there are several scholars that resonate with me as I am working through my studies on sacred texts. And if I'm studying something in the New Testament, I might turn to Lightfoot because he's one that I'm used to and he's one that I trust. He has done some really good work. I've read him in the past, and he's helped me understand some things that were difficult. So I trust what Lightfoot's going to tell me, and so I might turn to him in order to understand a passage that's very, very difficult to understand, that I need some insight with. So the idea here is that if I had, say, uh, um, if I had Lightfoot and if I had Wolf um, side by side, reading the both of them, now I've got 2 scholars explaining this passage, and they might have slightly different takes on that passage, but I'm going to have 2 different and better ideas. Or if another scholar, Welch. And so if I had Bridge, Welch, and Lightfoot, and I'm reading all 3 of them and their commentary on this particular passage that's giving me trouble, maybe I'm gaining a better understanding. So that's the idea here. You might have a bunch of different scholars side by side, all given equal weight. We're not going to say this one's right or this one's right. We're just saying here they are. They're all together. and you can read them and think about them and form your own ideas based on those things. Right, so the Talmud is going to be useful in that particular way. It is impossible to overstate the importance of the Talmud in Judaism. Students can spend their entire lives exploring its contents, and indeed, Orthodox Jews probably spend more time with the Talmud than with the Tanakh itself. With the entirety of the Old Testament, they spend more time, possibly, in the commentary. But the Talmud is not just another commentary, it is Torah, the oral counterpart to the written Torah given to Moses at Sinai, that Jews believe that even today the Talmud study should be done not alone, but with a partner. You're taking it in turns to read out loud and discuss. So it's something that isn't just written down like that Torah and it's kind of solid, but more this is something that you should take and chew on and try to ingest it for yourself and gain more and better insights and understanding as you discuss it, at least with a partner, right? So it's much more active, it's much more involved than just reading a text and seeing what it says. And it's more about digesting the text and understanding at a deeper level, not just what it says, but what it means, right? So it's a very different piece of work here. Although rabbis were not prophets, the Torah provided access to continuing revelation, the will of God, in new eras and situations, and that's why it stayed alive even throughout today, is because they take those things and they um, invest themselves and try to understand and untangle this great web that can sometimes be the Jewish sacred text, right? So that's what they're trying to do. Okay, all right. There is a form of Jewish mysticism, just kind of so you know, I'll mention later, probably an Islamic form of mysticism, but just so you know, there is one. I don't want to spend any time on it other than to just say it's there. If you're interested, you can text it. The masterpiece or the text that's influential in Jewish mysticism is called Zohar, Zohar. So if you're interested in Jewish mysticism, there's that, but I'm not going to take it any further than that. It's not something that is primary to most Jewish texts, but it is there if you're interested in that particular sacred text. When Jews use the word Torah, they sometimes have in mind the first five books of Moses, which they regard as authoritative. But sometimes it can refer to an expanded concept, not just those first five books, but also to the written and oral traditions that go along with it, like we were talking about. Moses got the Torah, but he also got that oral tradition to go. Sometimes that's what they mean. It kind of depends on the discussion and who you're talking to. There are several forms of Judaism in the world today. There's Orthodox Judaism, there's conservative, there's Reform, Reconstructionism, and I also like to mention that there are what's called secular Jews. That is to say, they still identify as Jewish, but they are not practicing Judaism in any way. It's part of their heritage, and it's part of their um, how they think of themselves, much like some of us might think of ourselves, say, as German. I'm German. I don't really think of myself as loyal to Germany, but I think of myself as that's part of my heritage. And sometimes there are secular Jews who are not practicing in any way whatsoever. It's not a religion for them. It's just part of where they came from, right? So there's lots of different kind of Judaism in the world today that differ in their degree of observance of the traditional rules and their engagements with the modern world, but they all come out of the rabbinical Judaism and its concern for the oral laws. They all come out of what we've been talking about so far with Judaism. It is interesting to imagine how different Judaism would be today if it had not closed its canon, meaning if it had not closed its group of scriptural writings. Maybe because today the Jewish Bible is closed. You can't add anything to it. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that it's not. The book's not itself isn't open. It means that you can't put more works in there. You can't write something and add it to that text. It's a closed canon. You can't add anything. Think of how different it might be if they were still accepting more authoritative writings. It could be quite different than what we see today. But um, in a very, very short amount of time, in a very fast study here of Judaism and its sacred texts. Hopefully, you understand a little bit more about what each of those particular texts were doing, where they came from, kind of their intent, why they exist in the format that they exist in, and hopefully also how they're used by some of the Jews who are faithful to those sacred texts and still encourage the use of them. Okay, all right, so that's Judaism and its sacred text, and I will see you next time.